Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. We're happy to share a recent chat with Matilda Bickers, co-editor and contributor to the recent PM Press collection, Working It, Sex Workers on the Work of Sex. For the hour, we talk about labor organizing in the erotic industries, Matilda's past experiences in publishing, hang-ups around sex work in radical communities, and related topics. We'll be linking the book and some other projects in the show notes. Just a quick heads up, the following conversation does contain references to sexual assault and childhood sexual assault, although there's not a lot of detail given, but just listener discretion is advised.
My name is Matilda. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a sex worker in Portland, Oregon. I run the outreach project Stroll, and we just published a book, an anthology of sex worker writing and art called Working It.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you in the context of this book that you co-edited and contributed to with PM Press that you just named. First up, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the collection and the zine that it grew out of. I'd love to hear about Stroll and also some of your publishing history in the sex work industry.
Sure. So I guess I'll start with when I was 17, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I met this group of sex workers. They did a zine called Danzine. Their group was called Danzine. And they did all of this stuff. They did street outreach. They put together a bad date list, which was they called all of the sex workers in the area and asked if they'd seen any bad clients that month. They lobbied for legislation that was friendlier to sex workers. And they were just so amazing. They put on art shows, they put on parties, they put on film festivals, and it really changed my life. And they went dormant when I was 18. And I was just like, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to do what they did. So I was a sex worker, and it's 2005. We tried to start a union at one of our clubs, and it didn't work. Organizing was just really hard, especially without Danzine around to get the word out. And then when I was 28, I think, in 2014, I decided to sue my club for misclassification and sexual harassment. And with that money, I started Stroll. And I got a grant from Cascade AIDS Project, which is a local AIDS project here, to do street outreach. And so between that and the money I had from the lawsuit, I was just like, okay, let's do this. So a group of friends and I just started Stroll. We wanted to do a monthly zine. We wanted to do street outreach. We really wanted to do everything that Danzine had done because there was nothing like that in the last, since they'd closed in 2003, 2002. And so that's what we did. And it was awesome for a while. The pandemic really put a cramp in our style, but we're actually thinking about a new art show. We maybe got a grant to do a new art show for the first one in 4 years. And so that's exciting. But so Working It was the zine that we put out. At first, it was supposed to be quarterly, but it's actually really hard to put out a zine on a regular basis, especially with a group like sex workers where, sometimes you don't have any money. And so you have to cancel whatever you're doing when you do get the chance to see a client to make that money that you need. So it was hard to put out on a regular schedule. It became biannual, and then it became annual. And then I hadn't put out an issue in like 6 months, and I was not planning on doing another issue when PM was like, we're looking for a sex worker anthology. Working It sounds like it might be a good fit. Can you send us some copies? And I did. And they were like, okay, we want to do an anthology. And that was 2020. So by that point, things had changed so radically that I was like, I don't really know how much of old Working It is applicable. I'll try to solicit new material. So I approached some friends and was like, do you want to help me with this project? And I was lucky they did. And so between that and like word of mouth, we just got a bunch of submissions. We went through them, worked with people. Again, it was really hard to get submissions on time. The project went from being due in the fall of 2020 to being due in the winter of 2021 to so on. And then we finally got everything in last fall, and the book came out this spring.
And when you had mentioned the labor conflict at the club, so this is a strip club or a dance club, and the issue of classification is about whether or not you were employees versus independent contractors. Is that kind of what it comes down to?
Yeah. So basically, strip clubs, we used to be employees. And then in the 90s, people were like, oh, we could make so much more money if we don't have to pay our workers. So they were like, you're actually independent contractors, and it's a better deal for you because you get to keep all your tips, which mostly we did anyway. You paid a fee to work. I don't think we paid fees to work as employees, but anyway, it changed. And so much administrative information has gone by in the last 30 years that now people are really convinced that it's a better deal to not make like a flat minimum wage, to not have benefits, and to pay out the ass through to the strip club. Like I was paying like $300, $400 a night sometimes to work, and that's really common. And there's nights where there's no customers and you leave in debt to the club, and the next night you have to hope that you make enough to pay back your debt and have a profit for yourself. And so really, according to the Bureau of Labor standards, strippers don't control enough of our work to be considered independent contractors. Like a plumber would be an independent contractor, somebody that you hire for a really specific job that you pay, they come in, they do the work, they go. But that's not how strippers are. You have a relationship with the club. You don't really control when you show up for the most part. You don't control, you have to wear sexy clothes. You have to wear heels of a certain size. And all of the fees that they charge are mostly illegal. Like you can't charge someone to come show up late and then to leave early. And it's pretty grotesque. We ended up settling on the sexual harassment. And I mean, this is off topic, but I just really thought that it would go differently, because in the dressing room, everyone hated what was happening. We hated the sexual harassment, hated paying so much to work. But as soon as the actual lawsuit came out, people were like, nope. We love our club. You are crazy. You are so greedy. I can't believe, it just did not go how I thought it would. But, we settled. I got money. I started Stroll. It worked out in the end. It was pretty traumatic for a while there, though.
Having been a bartender for a while, in terms of like a special engagement with employers where you end up, because of the way labor law in the U.S. was designed from back in the 1930s, food service is one of the industry. This is more for the audience's benefit, if in case they don't know. But like home care, agricultural work, food service are these like gendered and racialized categories of labor that were thrown under the bus in the 1930s when the National Labor Relations Act came was brought about by FDR. And so as like a former bartender, you get server wages, but you get a lot of tips. But that ends up meaning like it's not exactly an independent contractor situation, but you end up paying so much in taxes afterwards that sometimes it's questionable whether it's worth it or not. And especially in such like a physically grueling job as dancing at a club, I look back on instances in kitchens where I've cut myself accidentally or been out sick and had a contract with the employers. The idea of not having that kind of protection where I could take sick days, maybe even get sick pay because of some contract that I have, or get workers' comp in like the easy way that it's available in a lot of workplaces, just seems to add to the stress of that kind of working environment.
It's really harsh. Like there's a lot of clubs in Portland. You don't need a lot of money to start up. So there's a lot of divey bars that are just like, we have naked ladies and the dancers cover the expense of running the club. And I worked at one such club that had broken mirrors on stage, and it wasn't a problem as long as you didn't get too close to the mirrors. But I tripped one day and I fell against the mirror and I cut my hand open and I had to go to the emergency room for stitches. And it's just like, that happened, like I could try to sue the club for workers' comp, but I wouldn't be able to go back there to work. I would be out of work anyway. So it was just, stuff like that happens. We had, there's no protections for like germs, or there's no standards for clean stages. So back in 2004 to 2007, MRSA just kept going around the clubs. Everyone was getting MRSA. And eventually I think they caught on and, bleach became a standard for cleaning the stage and stuff. But it took a long time. And a lot of people were out of work because they had giant abscesses on their butts. It sucked.
So you mentioned like one of the important things about the source of working it and danzines and spread, like a lot of the importance of these projects is like, it's cool for people to be able to extend it, like to share poetry, to share artwork, to share short fiction and such. And I'm sure that these publications offered an opportunity for people to express their artistic side, but also that it provided that forum for people in erotic industries to share tips, to give heads up, and to like about bad practices or gigs, and to just like allow people to chew the fat as far as the employment situation went. Mm-hmm. So in 2018, FOSTA and SESTA were a couple of laws that were passed at the federal level shutting down platforms or pressuring in shifts of aspects of many surviving services used by people engaged in sex work for this kind of thing, to talk about bad dates, to talk about dangerous clubs or clubs that would rip you off, employers of that sort. These websites weren't necessarily the air quotes, by sex workers for sex workers model that these zines were, but people hack what they have to do what they want. So 5 years and a pandemic out from the law's passages, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about people's ability working in the erotic industries to share important info. And you don't have to name out any specific methods that would get those targeted, but I'd be curious to hear how people have hacked it.
Yeah, it's been interesting. At first, it was really, really harsh in the first 2-3 years after, because a lot of platforms that people used to advertise and to screen clients were shut down and there just wasn't anything. And, people gradually find they hack what's out there. So there's new blacklist sites where you can, if you have the app and people, you have to know people is the thing. You can check, who's a bad client. And there's things like the Dancers Resource, which rates clubs around the country for dancers from a dancer's perspective. So there's stuff out there, but now it's not you can't just Google bad client list or escort reviews. That's the stuff that exists now for sex workers. You have to know someone. So people starting out in the industry, unless, they're on Reddit already, but, the good forums on Reddit screen, so you have to be a sex worker to join them. So new sex workers are I feel like they're kind of screwed. And that really sucks. Because you need the community, but a lot of people just, you can't trust people you don't know. So if they don't have an established history as a sex worker, they're kind of out of luck until they build one. Yeah, it's harsh. But there are open forums on Reddit that clients can access that are less secure, but you can get generic tips on that. There's people on Tumblr, on Instagram. It's out there if you are really dedicated, but it's not the same. It's not the same level of ease. You can't access it with the same level of ease that you used to be able to.
As an outcome of those two laws, did you notice distinctive changes in the ways, besides the way that people communicated with each other, in how sex work was operating or how people were talking about in their distinct cities, shifts because of the shutting down of those sort of platforms?
Well, clients got a lot more emboldened, and so did people who, make money off of sex workers. Pimp is a really loaded term, and it covers legally it covers anybody from a friend that you pay to do security. Anybody who takes money is a pimp or a trafficker, even when the relationship is much more complicated than that. But people who have who want to have an exploitative relationship with sex workers were really emboldened. I think everyone I know got contacted and was are you running out of clients? I have a client list, I can help you. And then clients were there's more of you than there are of us. We have the money, we have the power. And a lot of people didn't submit to screening anymore. They were just we don't have to. You're desperate. You don't have advertising forums anymore. So you have to take what you can get. And, there was a lot of violence. There was, I think Hacking and Hustling was tracking how many people, were reported dead or missing in the months after SESTA. So it was really scary for a long time. And it still sucks. It's still not great.
So you and Melissa Dittmore, in the introduction, touch on the trafficking framing of anti-prostitution law enforcement in this country, in the USA, that it's often built around this idea of preserving the innocence of this character of the white cis woman, protecting their innocence for marriage to a white cis man and procreation of white families. That's a part of the imaginary that has at times been more or less coded into law. Conversely, police, laws, courts, and prisons have engaged the bodies of women and other people of color as a threat to the stability of the white nation and the white family. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about white patriarchal imaginary and the discourse of sex trafficking in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that, from the beginning, sex trafficking has been really useful for white patriarchy to reinforce it. Everybody's fears of the dark-skinned rapist, other man who isn't a white man, and innocent white womanhood and sexuality, it funnels so beautifully into that trafficking hysteria. And it hasn't changed that much. It's really kind of surprising to me how little it's changed since 1912, which is when I think the Mann Act was passed. I forget. But, this woman just shot a man of color in Texas. He was her Uber driver, and he was taking her to the city that she wanted to go in. But for what, trafficking hysteria on the internet has reached the point where she was like, oh my God, he's kidnapping me. And she shot and killed him. And, and it just, these white supremacist narratives serve to reinforce the status quo. And, like you get Cindy McCain looking at a man of color with his daughter, who I think was mixed race, but they were in an airport. Have you heard about this story? They were in an airport and Cindy McCain was like, oh my God, he's trafficking her. And he was her father, but like this hysteria blinds people to really obvious realities. And it makes them so afraid that you can't talk to them about it. Like the fear is so intense that somebody would shoot their Uber driver rather than just be like, he's probably taking me. Like, what are the odds? It's it's so intense to me. And it just, it serves to, if you don't trust people of color and you're like, they're out to traffic me, you can't build solidarity around that. Like, you can't see what's actually happening, which is that like white supremacy is closing in around us and taking away our autonomy and just, limiting us and destroying the world, really.
And I think like a thing that approach has shown over and over again is that it fills a certain psychological need, maybe, that the system imbues in us, in a lot of people in the US, especially white folks, for this sort of danger narrative, for this fear, that this existential fear that we're already experiencing, whether it be in the explicitly racialized version or not, whether it be the idea of the groomer or the like QAnon trafficking, like farming children for endocrine or whatever, or like the groomer narratives around trans folks and queer folks generally. But it doesn't actually make actual victims of trafficking any safer. It actually seems like it endangers them a lot more.
Yeah.
You talk about that a little bit in the introduction too, and like the inactivity or the shifting of focus from where many cases of assault and trafficking actually occur. Can you talk about that a little bit and that shift?
Yeah. I mean, agriculture is the number one like vehicle for trafficking. Like, it's just by millions of people. It's just millions more people than are being abused sexually or commercially sexually exploited. And you can be sexually exploited in agriculture. Like the two aren't mutually exclusive, but it just doesn't have the same visceral resonance, I guess, with white people that the trafficking narrative does. And so people don't. I mean, you were talking about the labor laws of the 1930s, and I just found out that actually agricultural workers were deliberately left out of those because most of them were Black, and white people didn't want to extend protections to Black people. And I was just like, oh my God. And from then on, from early on, you just have these structures that are built, and they don't go away unless you really address them, and people don't want to address them. It's too innate in our society for us to want to see them. But yeah, the majority of people experiencing commercial sexual exploitation are women of color. They're like youths of color, they're LGBT youth, they're people in domestic violence situations. They don't fit the like kidnapped, taken white girl, narrative. And that is also less appealing, I guess, to the media and to, we don't have the same empathy for them that we do for supposedly innocent white people. And that's how you get people like Cyntoia Brown, who are being sexually exploited as youth, and they defend themselves and they go to prison. And Cyntoia is, luckier than most because she got like Kim Kardashian on her side. And so she got, out early. But there's a lot of people who are still suffering in prisons, for defending themselves against their traffickers. We're like so deliberately closed off to the reality of what's happening that like the Oakland police force in 2016 or so many people in the Oakland police force were involved in sexually exploiting this young girl that they ran through something like 9 police chiefs in 2 weeks. Every time they got a new one, it came out that person was also involved in sexually exploiting her. And that didn't really make the news that it should have. And not very much changed. Eventually they found a police chief who wasn't involved in it. She had a lawsuit against the city and she's doing okay now. But we don't want to look at the ways that our system actually enables exploitation, the ways that laws are really set up to enable and further exploitation. Like most sexual abuse happens, from somebody it often happens in the family. And we don't have any will to look that straight in the eye and address it. There's no political will to do that, which is really sad to me. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, it seems like two of the main parts of that, and whether or not they're considered like commercial trafficking or just like personal trafficking, it's harm either way, but access and power are the two like commonalities. Like when I was coming up was in the mid 1990s in the Catholic Church was when a lot of finally the media started being able to hear from victims of assault within the church that had been covered up for so long, because it was just assumed based on the character of church officials that they would not do something like this, that when complaints would come up, they would get pushed off to the side. It's not that different from when it happens that like the head of a patriarchal family or someone who might be an upstanding, quote unquote, upstanding person in the community, or a chief of police in the running for, police department. Yeah. Anyway, So connected to this, I've heard people working in the sex industry express that there's a massive failure of leftist, labor, and feminist movements, including anarchists, to sufficiently address both the dignity of sex workers as workers, as well as the validity of people's choices to engage in erotic labor. I'm guessing it's maybe because, as you note in some of your writings, that people have trouble deriding an industry and the bad practices within an industry without devaluing the labor that people are forced to get extracted from them in order to make a living. How do you think that non-sex worker leftists more broadly and anarchists specifically could be better allies?
I think there just need to be a lot more conversations, and people need to be a lot more willing to like put themselves on the line and do things that are going to be unpopular, which, in this climate, I totally understand why people don't want to put themselves out there. You don't want an internet mob to get mad at you and go after you. But, that's the only way. Like, you have to just take a stand that's unpopular, which is that, sex workers deserve rights and protections. And I feel like there's a lot of talking points that people could use that don't get used. You always hear like sex work is not sex trafficking. I mean, and it can be, any work can be exploited, and sex work is work, sex work can be exploited. I feel like a better talking point would be like, all of this stuff is already illegal. Like child sexual abuse is illegal, rape is illegal. And obviously it doesn't get addressed, but that is not the problem of sex workers, like that's a cultural problem, and we need to be addressing that. But the problems that people have with the sex industry are just problems that they have with the culture, our culture at large. Sex work is illegal. It's already illegal. And that's not changing anything. Like sex work still exists, child sexual abuse still exists, sexual exploitation still exists. You can't make things that are illegal. You can make them more illegal, you can increase the punishments, but it doesn't do anything to address the like material realities that lead to these things, which is that we don't value women, we don't value children, we don't value people of color. We don't care when their autonomy is infringed upon, and we enable power to reinforce itself, And I feel like those are all pretty good talking points, but they are uncomfortable. Again, like it is uncomfortable to admit that, most sexual abuse occurs from somebody, that things that are illegal still happen. It's funny, we're willing to face that with murder. Like true crime podcasts are so popular, but when it comes to sex, I don't know, people have real hangups about sex. And I guess that's another thing that we need to start like talking about more, is that like sex is natural, it happens. I don't know what more to say, but people have problems with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like oft commented on, but in terms of what is considered explicit or considered like acceptable like content, depending on age ranges of people in the U.S. culture, according to the U.S. government, is usually like extreme violence is acceptable to in some way. Bodily functions and sex are things that are explicitly like verboten to talk about on the radio, for instance. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of hangups for us to go through. It seems pretty culturally specific. In your essay, Intimate Labor, in that collection, you talk about the scenario that you experienced where you were working in a club and you were engaging with some of the customers around like the possibility of them doing sex work. So it's sort of like, it seems like pressing boundaries and also being playful and just kind of like testing the waters to be like, well, you're engaging with this in a certain way as a consumer, but is this a thing that you would engage with? And I think you had some like would you consider doing dancing, like doing a private dance for someone in a professional setting? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on the trap of moralizing the act of sex as something that is either only sanctioned by the church or the state, and the choices that people make without money changing hands to informally exchange erotic work for shelter or relative safety. And like the distinction that people express towards comparing these acts where somebody will do this act, like will have sex with someone or do something erotic or make them feel a certain way in exchange for getting a thing that they need, and how people put that on a different sort of like field of reality from the drudgery that we put ourselves through on a regular basis for a legal wage.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, the people who inspired me to first ask that question were these two women who were like flashing the club, they were like taking their clothes off. And so I was just like, what would, you're doing it for free. How much money would you to just up it a little bit and actually interact with like a customer? And yeah, it was like $1 million. And Annie has to be hot. And I was just like, you were just flashing the club for free. I don't understand the difference. And actually, I was just listening to this podcast, Just Break Up. And the letter writer today was like, I'm in a polycule. One of my partners just got the offer to be a sugar baby from this woman. And I'm fine with him having sex with her, but I'm not fine with him having sex with her for money. And I was just like, I don't understand. Like, what? Like, I would understand if she didn't want to share him with one more person, but just the act of money made it so different to her that she was like in crisis and writing to these, strangers on Just Break Up. And I really like, it's so, has this emotional weight. We're taught that sex has this emotional weight, but only when it's exchanged for money. Like, you go to bars, like this person was in a polycule and has multiple partners and has clearly like done some thought about relationships. And, there's swingers clubs, there's all kinds of things. People are willing to have sex for free in all kinds of situations that aren't even safe. But as soon as you add money, they're just like, no. And it's not, I don't think it's just because it's criminalized, like I could see that like weighing in on some people, but it's the people that I've asked, I don't think they're thinking about that. It's just like the act of having sex for money would somehow diminish them in a way that they aren't willing to deal with. And it's so weird to me because, we spend our lives in work that we hate for the most part. Even if you're lucky and you get a job that you like, it's still work. But most people don't have jobs that are really fulfilling. Most people show up to work, they're cleaning houses, they're sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day. And you can make this amount of money in like 3 minutes. Like a lap dance is $20. Or if you sell a half hour, that's like $250. An hour is $500. And it's just so, it's like kind of reclaiming your time in a way. To me, like that's what I found so appealing about the sex industry, is that like I don't like working for other people. I don't like being around other people. I like sitting at home and daydreaming and reading books. And it gives you this return on your time that enables you to do that. It enables you to do the things that you want to do that make life meaningful. And people can't, they can't get over their emotional hang up about exchanging sex for money. Even if you put it in terms where you're like, yeah, in 1 hour, you could make half of your rent. And that's time. That's like 2 weeks that you would have back to do whatever you want with. But no, there's just like some kind of mental block. I guess if there weren't that mental block, more people would do it and then the market would be saturated. So like personally, I guess I'm grateful for it, but I do think it's really strange. I've kind of theorized, like I've talked to other people and, I know the rates of child sexual abuse, so they're just high. But I do know a lot of people who did deal with child sexual abuse, including myself. And I wonder if that like kind of the fact that we don't see sex as sacred anymore, like some people do still see it as sacred, but like for me, I was just like, oh, this is just a thing. This is just an act, and people can make you feel bad about it. But like I'm not gonna let them make me feel bad about this. I like for a while I considered myself contaminated, and then I worked through that, and then I was just like, it's just another thing that people do. it's on par with picking your nose sometimes. Like, it can be really gross. It can be really awesome, but it's just a thing that people do. And I can make money. And then, I have this money and I have all this time to do stroll, to do street outreach, to do the things that give my life meaning. And I've been struggling with the fact that I don't have time to do the things that give my life meaning anymore, because I'm trying to transition out of the industry into nursing. Nursing gives my life meaning, but I struggle with the fact that I can't read anymore. Like, I can't read books. I have to study constantly. I do really backbreaking work for minimum wage. I get sexually harassed by patients. There's a joke among nurses and nursing students that male patients they want you to hold their penis for them while they pee in the urinal, and it's just like, you don't have to do that. Like, we tell everyone, because if you aren't already told, you'll get conned into it. And I was conned into it. And so, like, I'm still dealing with people's sexual abuse, kind of. Like, I do regard that as sexual abuse. It's not heavy. It's just really annoying. But, and I miss having time, and I miss being paid and on a rate that I approve of. Yeah, I don't know what the solution is. I don't know why people, I guess if it's just drilled into you from childhood, it's hard to overcome. But some people overcome it and some people don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I like also how in that essay you talk about, like, as you mentioned, like, it would be nice to get paid way better for this, like, back-breaking, and not to say that, like, dancing in a club or being a sex worker, like, more generally is not a lot of work, obviously, like, it is, but you sort of go into describing, like, having to handle all sorts of stuff that you would not handle necessarily if you would charge a different amount, like, but also you would be able to walk away because the circumstances would be different. But I like the point that you make the argument, medical workers deserve to be, like, people who work in hospice, people who work in care houses, all these things get paid really poorly to take care of people. It's emotionally draining work. It's physically draining work. It can be dangerous. And you wish that you could get that, the same money that you had otherwise, which is not to say that you are wishing that sex work was paid less, but you're just wishing that, like, medical workers are being paid more. And I think that that's, like, a good introduction to a conversation of where the society's at. Not saying that, creating a black market for a thing makes it cost more. And so, as you said about, like, the market getting glutted with people doing the work more publicly, if it was legalized, that would be, or decrim or whatever. But yeah, I don't know where I'm going. Now I'm off topic. I remember, back before pandemic began, there was a lot of discussion from Red Umbrella projects about about pushing for decrim, or, like, critiques of the, I don't know what you'd call, like, the Nordic model, similar to the prison system, the Nordic model. Is that still a dialogue that's going on and being pushed in organizations that you operate in, or has the critique changed since pandemic?
No, the Nordic model is deathless. It's currently rebranded as it's something like partial decrim. It's called partial decrim now, because, theoretically you're decriminalizing the seller's side, but not the purchaser's side. But it's still the Nordic model. It's still, people still die under it. It's still stigmatized. They have it in Canada, and it hasn't, like, rates of murder are still very high among sex workers. Sex workers are still abused. There's the case of the woman in Sweden, which also has the Nordic model or Swedish model. She was a sex worker. The sale of sex was legal, but, the purchase of it isn't. But nothing around the sale of sex had been decriminalized. So she was still stigmatized and trying to find an apartment. The child welfare system still discriminated against her and took her kids away. And she'd gotten into sex work because she was trying to leave an abusive husband. And she did manage to leave him, but they gave custody of her kids to the abusive husband. And she was only allowed to see them on, visits with him. And in one of the visits with him, he stabbed her and he killed her. And it's just like, he was obviously not a safe person for children to be around or for her to be around. But because she was a sex worker, the state was like, no, we're going to force you into these unsafe situations. And that's one of my big flaws, critiques of the Nordic model, is that it doesn't make sex workers safer. And it doesn't, it never comes with funding to get you out of sex work. Like, I personally would love to be rescued from sex work. Like, I would love for someone to give me money so that I could quit. but there's never any funding. People email me all the time and they're like, I want to get out of sex work. I'm in a domestic violence relationship. Like, and I'm like, there's nothing. I'm so sorry. There's nothing. Like, there are some resources for DV relationships, not enough. But there's nothing specifically to help you get out of trafficking. Like, you can contact the religious organizations and see, Shared Hope International, which is an anti-trafficking organization, is across the river. And I've directed people to them, with the caveat that they're probably not going to do anything, but you should try. And they never do anything. They never are like, oh my God, you need rent? You need rent so that you can leave the sex industry? Here's your rent, So that's my biggest critique of the Nordic model, is not only that it doesn't make people safe, but that it never comes with funding, the funding that you need. If you want to eradicate an industry, you have to give people options. You have to give them something else to pay their rent, to pay for their childcare, to pay, for everything. Life costs money under capitalism. So yes, it's still around. It's still a discussion. I have a friend in nursing school, and she's from Hawaii, and Affirm, I don't know whether you've heard of Affirm, but they're a big proponent of the Nordic model in Hawaii. And so that's been a conversation lately that she's been sending me, little snippets of. It's just, I'm just like, what are you, some of the critique, or some of their critique is really on point. Like, they talk about how Indigenous women have been affected by colonialism and imperialism, and, missing and murdered Indigenous women they're missing and murdered because they're Indigenous. Like, there's a much higher rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women than there are white women. But the solution to that, I don't think, like, they automatically go to all prostitution is wrong. All prostitution is an extension of imperialism, which it might be, but you aren't helping Indigenous women by making it illegal and pushing them further away from resources. Like, it's just, nothing is made better by being made illegal. Like, drugs aren't made safer by being made illegal. Alcohol wasn't made safer by being made illegal. Like, that's just not how it works. So it's still out there. It still makes me really angry.
I guess coming back to the legislation from 5 years ago, the assault on sex worker organizing and safety that was FOSTA SESTA feels like a bellwether for legislation and court decisions at state and federal levels since eroding bodily autonomy around abortion, contraception, education on social struggle, history, gender identity, and non-hetero relationships across the country. Like, more plainly said, there is a huge backlash in the system across the U.S. against any push towards egalitarianism, towards breaking down the patriarchy, the history of racism, all these things. Can you talk about how a robust defense of the rights of people engaging in sex work to better their working conditions and their personal safety dovetails with the defense of sexual and gender autonomy more broadly?
Yeah, I think they're all issues of bodily autonomy, and they're all issues around the fact that we need to rethink the way we look at sex and gender and people's bodily autonomy. It all comes from the same stigma against, like misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and fear and hatred of sex workers. It all stems from the same, like, white supremacist patriarchal source. And if we're going to combat any one aspect of it, we need to combat all of it. Like, you can't just leave a little patch of weeds when you're going through, because they'll take over. Like, invasive species, sorry, my metaphor is a little bit convoluted, but, like, you can't leave anything behind. Otherwise, oppression still exists. I feel like abortion is a really clear parallel with it. A lot of feminists don't want to see it that way, but, it's what somebody does with their body. And you can't tell people what to do with their bodies as long as they're not harming another person. You can't do that. Like, even if I have a friend who uses drugs, and that's her choice, that's her right. She gets to decide what's best for her and how she wants to cope with reality. And she knows what's best for her. A person who's pregnant, they know what's best for them, whether they want to carry the child to term or not. And a sex worker, without very many options, like, a sex worker knows what options are best. Like, if there was a better economic option, probably they would be doing that.
So we're kind of winding up at this point. Are there any sites or projects that if someone is considering getting involved in sex work or are involved in sex work and maybe aren't aware of, that would help in their circumstances of organizing or of just day-to-day survival in the so-called USA? Are there any shining lights that you'd specifically point them towards to help?
There's like local projects like Bay Area Sex Worker Support, GreenLightProject up in Seattle, Eileen's, which is just outside of Seattle. I think that Swap Brooklyn closed. There's not very many. You know, if you like Google Swap, you can find local swaps that are more active. Swap USA isn't very active. And then, you know, there's local projects, but there isn't a whole lot to direct people to. So like there's the Dancers Resource on Instagram, and they have an app if you are looking to get into dancing. I like the sex worker communities on Reddit, even though if you're not like, if you don't have documentation that you're a sex worker, you're not going to be able to get into the secure ones. But yeah, there just isn't a whole lot out there, unfortunately.
And it seems like a hard thing to build when there's always law enforcement or whoever, churches probably, that are looking to shut stuff down. So how can people find you online? And as far as other media sources that carry news of sex worker concerns by sex workers, are there any others you want to point people to? I guess that kind of covers some of what was in the last question too.
You can find me online. I'm on Instagram at StrollPDX, and that's really it for me. But let's see, other media with sex workers. I liked We Too, which is another anthology edited by Natalie West, I think. I don't know if many like newsletters or zines anymore. StripperWeb just shut down this year, that was a really good resource for people. I think there's an archive of it somewhere, but it isn't the whole site because that would have been impossible to do. Really, it's kind of bleak these days. I think there's a lot of community on Instagram and TikTok and Reddit, and I would just kind of look for sex workers there. Yeah, there was a sex worker festival in San Francisco this year, Sex Worker Art and Film Festival, that I think Bay Area Sex Worker Support did, but not a lot.
Are there any questions that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to speak on?
You know, I always love going off about like the dancer struggle for rights, and like Stripper Strike NoHo and a club here in Portland just voted to join a union. So like that kind of stuff.
That's cool. Do you want to talk about that club and what union it is?
Oh, sure. Yeah. There's a club in Portland that just voted to unionize, and I think they're going with Actors Equity. I think it's the same union that Stripper Strike NoHo joined. I can't remember what club the strippers down in LA were organizing at, but here it's Magic Tavern, and I think it's so exciting. The pushback was so intense. It's always so intense, and people are so scary and hateful whenever anyone tries to organize. Like the threats are really, you know, people died in like the 30s for trying to organize, and it hasn't gotten that much better, you know, 80 years later. I think they're so brave, and I love it. I love watching that. I hope that it goes really well for them. And I encourage people to look up the Magic Tavern Dancers on Instagram. I think it's Magic Tavern Dancers and Stripper Strike NoHo. Cool.
I'll definitely link those in the show notes. Thank you very much for having this conversation. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
The Anarchist Radio Berlin.
From across the pond.
So it's the Anarchist Radio Berlin.
With audios in English, Spanish, and German.
And please,
don't mention the war.
You can find us at channelzeronetwork.com and aradio-berlin.org.
Poklicali ste Črno luknjo in njeno kontrainformativno mrežo. Po pisku oddajte svoj glas.
We have on the line a comrade that is now based in Chiapas, Mexico. Thank you for taking your time to make this conversation with us. Let's start with some basic information about what you do in Chiapas. If we understand correctly, you are engaged in different forms of practical solidarity with the struggle of the Zapatista communities. Can you be more specific about what is it that you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm working in a media collective. We're doing audiovisual formation, and we started in 1998 when there were like more open state repression on the Zapatista communities. And there, my collective came in and brought cameras, like video cameras, and started to give formation so that all the repression could be captured and could be shown to the world. And from 2014 on, the Tercios Compass, the media compass from the Zapatistas, were founded, and so it wasn't necessary anymore that we would give formation if the EZLN would do it by themselves. And so now we're more working with other struggles here in Chiapas, for example, the defense of territory and stuff like that. But yeah, we're here, and if like communities need some help with movie stuff and media, we are here to help. And also we did cover the media in the last caravan that was the South Resist, and that was our latest thing we did.
Okay. Now let's turn to the recent worrying events in Chiapas. A few days ago, an urgent news reached us about an attack of paramilitary forces against one of the Zapatista autonomous communities. Can you say more about what exactly happened? How serious was the attack? And are these kind of attacks against Zapatista communities common?
Yeah, okay. On May 22nd, there was the last attack on the community Moises and Gandhi, which is part of the autonomous municipality Lucio Cabañas, which is part of the 10th Caracol, Patria Nueva. And first from one side of the village, they started to shoot members of the Orcao at around 4 p.m. And at 8 p.m. from the other side of the village, another part of Orcao was starting to fire as well. And in this fire, the compa Jorge López Santis was shot in the chest, and first he was denied medical service, but after urgent action by human rights centers, they got that he went to hospital in Tuxtla Gutiérrez, which is the capital of Chiapas, where he still hasn't adequate medical care, but his situation is, as far as I know, he's still living, and sadly, it's not a only case. There's also aggressions on the community in Nuevo San Gregorio, which is also part of Caracol 10. 1 year ago, there was also the displacement of the community Emiliano Zapata and the community and another community, where you see that the violence against communities from the EZLN is still happening.
Okay, you mentioned Orcao. Orcao is, if we understand correctly, a paramilitary force that is behind also this latest attack. Can you say more about what Orcao is? What is the agenda that they have, the methods that they use, who are they fighting for, and what is the relation of Orcao with the Mexican state?
Yeah, so I think for explaining what Orcao is, I will go back in history, and the translation of Orcao is Regional Organization of Coffee Growers. So it was founded in 1988, and firstly had the function of fighting for fair coffee pricing, so that the coffee planters could have like a good life, which is a good thing, I think. But with the time, in the late 90s, Orcao started to work with the state and get state funds and positions and power in the government and things like that in change for doing favors for the government. And from then on, attacks started in 2002. They attacked the Poblado Javier López and burned the crops of the Zapatistas that are growing their food there. And it went on. In 2009, there was the attempt of displacing people from Bosque Bonito, which is another community, and also the attempt to attack the Caracol in Morelia, while there was an international encounter in San Cristobal. Also in 2011, they attacked Poblado del Paraíso, destructed 4,500 coffee plants, and there were armed attacks on support bases of the ZLN. And in the following years it went on like that. There's a large register of the attacks against Zapatista communities. And sadly also this attack on Moises Gandhi is not a new thing. They started in 2019 to do armed attacks on this community. And there's a total impunity of this organization and their attacks and their violence. So I think there you can see like the first connection it has with the state, and also that research of the ZLN brought to light that the money the state was sending for a school was used in arms of big impact. And maybe for showing a little bit more how the connection between the state and Orcao is, I think it's good to look into the program of counterinsurgency that's still going on. Yeah, and there's like the open attacks by military and the open repression after the San Andrés, los acuerdos de San Andrés. This open violence changed more to a low-intensity war, and parts of that are the paramilitary, like Orcao or los Chicholines or other military paramilitary groups, and displacements, which we see in Chiapas a lot. There's like 70,000 displaced persons in Chiapas. And also selective or massive assassinations is sadly a thing that's seen oftenly. And all of this fits very good into an analysis many critical persons have in Mexico, which is that state, economic forces like capitalist big firms, and also the organized crime are like doing a thing, the three of them. And so for example, big landowners really often are the government forces and have their own friends with the organized crime. So there's a really powerful connection between these, and really much corruption. And so often, like when there's a capitalist interest, they say to the governors, we can give you money for implementing our project in this part. And if the people say no, the organized crime or the paramilitary will hit there, and afterwards the capitalist interests can enter there. And so I think this connection is like a really visible thing.
Okay. And then how does the EZLN and the Zapatista communities deal with this kind of attacks and other forms of pressure?
Yeah, so in the last few years, I didn't hear much about how they answered to these attacks. But a little while longer ago, there was, for example, in La Garucha, which is like another caracol, there were attacks, and the ZLN sent men that were not armed with firearms, but just with sticks, but it was really many military forces of the ZLN, and they went to this community that was attacked, and there, the people that were armed with firearms, the aggressors, tried to attack, but they went to them and said, "So you can try to kill every one of us, but we're really many people." So in the end, they gave their arms. They went away because there was too much presence of the ZLN. And the Zapatista communities, there are also other strategies like from the civil arm. So, for example, if there's like a land in dispute that other groups want to enter, sometimes the ZLN or members of the SZLN go there and plant and have their presence there, and so the aggressors don't enter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe let's now move a little bit sideways and speak more about the general dynamics in Chiapas in last period.
Yeah, that's like a really, really hard thing. Like the last 6 years, more or less, the violence in Chiapas increased a lot. That was, for one part, I think, because of the elections and because the change of power always brings violence with it here. And also in the last years, there is an open dispute between two cartels, like the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is one really big power, and the Cartel Sinaloa. Chiapas is like the most southern state of Mexico. It is the border with Guatemala, and so this plaza, this region is very important to traffic drugs. And so, these cartels are trying to get the control over it, and with that, a lot of violence is happening. Also, there are territorial conflicts between communities, and so there are armed groups that are willing to give everything to kill for having territory. Mm-hmm. And it's really crazy around here. Like nearly every day you can hear about assassinations, about armed conflicts, about a lot of violence. So sadly, the attacks on the SZLN not are the only thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. There's a much more of violence going on.
Okay. After Journey for Life, there was practically no official declaration from SZLN, except a short statement about the war in Ukraine, and that was already in March 2022, so more than 1 year ago. At the same time, some sources that are linked to the Zapatistas and their supporters of their struggle, such as Schools for Chiapas website, they openly warn that Chiapas is on the brink of, how they put it, civil war. Can you maybe comment both on the silence around of SZLN in the context of high tensions and on the civil war concept itself?
Yeah, so I think for one part, the silence of the SZLN is a thing that already happened in the history. So, for example, the thing that came up 2 months ago is the case of Manuel Gomez Vázquez, which is a base of support of the SZLN, who was taken prisoner 2.5 years ago. And just now, two months ago, the SZLN made their research and they finished it, and so they did the case openly. They mentioned it to to human rights organizations. And I think also, for example, in 2000, before the SZLN went to Mexico City, there was like a period of 3 years that they didn't went publicly. And I think that's like a thing, that they take their decisions and take their time to make good decisions. Mm-hmm. And also that was what compañeros in the Journey for Life were telling us, so that they took 11 years to plan their insurgency, and this is a big thing to plan, but also other things. I think they take their time to do the right decision, and maybe in some time there will be big changes, or maybe it's going to take a little bit longer, and they're not going to be that big, but I think something's going to happen, and SZLN certainly knows when they want to let us know.
Okay. And about the civil war?
The civil war, I think it wasn't the comunicado they did about the sequestration, the kidnapping of the the two buses de apoyo while there was the Journey for Life. Mm-hmm. And I think they related it to this general normalization of violence in Chiapas, and that it's like a really delicate situation.
Okay.
That would be my understanding of the statement of the brink of civil war.
Yeah, we also remember, yes, that during Journey for Life, they stressed a lot the challenges ahead and the difficult situation that for sure is awaiting them on their return. I believe that we have slowly running out of time. So I would ask you for the conclusion just one, let's say, classic question. It's about what can the supporters of the Zapatista struggle from around the world do, both about these latest particular incidents of violence and, of course, in general. This, and, of course, if you would like to add something that hasn't been mentioned before, please feel free to do so.
Yeah. So I think, sadly, directly here, there can't be done much because the people in power have the arms, and what we can do is show our solidarity, because like international solidarity often can prevent other things to happen and also can too much pressure. So I think for one part, there's yesterday there was published a national and international statement against the attacks against the Zapatista communities, and also there's a convocation for the 8th of June for an international day against the aggressions against the Zapatista communities, and I think that's basically what people around the world can do: show that they see what's happening and show that the state can't do this without people noting all over the world.
Thank you for the time that you took. Greetings from northwestern Balkans to the southeast of Mexico. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
The United States Supreme Court has taken a big fat dump on the coffee table again. Well, a few big fat dumps. It seems that since the Dobbs decision last summer, when the court reversed Roe versus Wade, which gave 36% abortion opponents what they wanted, while enraging 64% of the population, the Supreme Court has been methodically and deliberately provoking everyone to riot. That hasn't manifested yet, although one guy brought a can of gasoline and book of matches to the Supreme Court steps. Unfortunately, he lit himself on fire and left the entirety of the Supreme Court undamaged. Too bad. That guy seemed more useful than all the justices put together. In a string of rulings, the Supreme Court has managed to enrage just about everyone from sea to shining sea. They ruled that Biden's student loan debt forgiveness plan was unconstitutional, which now stacks thousands in student loan debts back onto the shoulders of the American college students who may have already overextended themselves when the debt forgiveness plan was put into place. Then, the Supreme Court ruled that college admissions practices of considering race as a factor was unconstitutional, leading many to conclude that another nail has been pounded in the coffin of affirmative action. Then, on the top of all that, the court decided that a business can have a religious right, and that businesses with religious beliefs that homosexuality is a sin can refuse to provide services for gay weddings. For the first time declaring that religious belief can be an excused cause for discrimination against a protected class. In my own thinking, of all those cases, the third one has the most serious and disturbing implications. In that case, a business owner with a particularly conservative Christian belief wants excused from serving gay weddings because she believes homosexuality is a sin. In that case, the court found that the business owner's religious freedom was more important than gay couples' rights to be free from discrimination. The implications are troubling because this opens the door. What if a white business owner in Alabama or Mississippi has a religious belief that races shouldn't intermingle and refuses to allow black patrons to sit at his lunch counter? Welcome back to 1958. What all of this signals is a new era, and it seems a lot of people are now waking up enraged. The news media is even observing this new thing, although they understand it slightly wrong, I think. They're now talking about how courts have become a kind of undemocratic center of governmental power, issuing rulings that are counter to the beliefs and desires of the vast majority of Americans. It's true that the courts are a center of undemocratic power. What's not true is that this is somehow new. Courts have always been a bulwark that operates without any kind of regard for popular opinion or democratic will. Courts have never cared whether anyone likes what they do. What's new is that the current incarnation of the Supreme Court is pretty brazen about deliberately cherry-picking cases and issuing decisions that resonate only with that 30-something percentile of self-identifying conservatives. What's new is not what they're doing, but how honest they're being about doing it. It's almost as if the Supreme Court has embraced the antipathy. You don't like us? We don't care. Take this work. I can imagine Justice Brett Kavanaugh saying, I've got all these angry abortion rights people camped out in my yard. Maybe if we take away their student debt relief, they'll have to get jobs to work off their bills and stop peeing in my wife's flower garden. It's like the court sees itself in an inimical conflict with the American people and American culture, and they like it. Their position is pretty clear. We don't care what you think. We don't have to answer to you. The whole foundational myth of popular sovereignty is out the window. Apologists on the far right justify this judicial coup by claiming the court isn't guided by fundamentally undemocratic extremist motives. But that the conservative justices are simply applying a pure and historical method of viewing the Constitution. You'll hear them talk about strict constructionism. Strict constructionism is, as they describe it, a way to interpret what the founding writers of the U.S. Constitution intended. So when they think about any particular issue arising in law, they ask themselves what the original framers intended for the Constitution to be and how the framers expected the Constitution to be applied. By framing this as an intellectual approach, they can sidestep the reality that it's an ideological approach, that when you confine the Constitution to mean only what 18th century white men with muskets imagined it to be, you can transport the culture back to a time of conquest and slavery and the domination of rich white straight men who ran everything, which isn't that different from today. But this strict constructionism is even worse than that. Strict constructionist Supreme Court justices say they're only interpreting the Constitution to mean what the original framers intended. The problem is the original framers never intended for the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution in the first place. If you actually read Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, the Supreme Court has a number of powers delegated to it. It has the power to set up and regulate the operation of lower courts. It has jurisdiction to hear appeals. It has trial court jurisdiction in cases involving U.S. citizens in foreign countries. But you know what power the Constitution does not give the Supreme Court? The power to interpret the U.S. Constitution and impose its interpretation on other branches of government or onto the states. It's just not in there. In fact, the first time anyone suggested the Supreme Court had that power was in 1832, long after the constitutional framers had sputtered out. And you know who said the Supreme Court had that power? The Supreme Court. This is the power the court gave to itself. It's not in the Constitution. So if any of those justices were really strict constructionalists, in their next case they'd say, Pretty much everything we've done since 1832 is bullshit. But don't hold your breath. They like power, and that's what it's really all about. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org.
This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 610 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm Books is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.